All right, let's dive into a film that really stirred things up back in 2004. Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ. Back then, religious films rarely made a splash in the mainstream. But this one, focusing on the last 12 hours of Jesus' life, it became a global phenomenon. So how did this film break through? What sparked all the controversy? And why are we still talking about it today?
Well, it's fascinating, really. The Passion of the Christ kind of emerged at a cultural crossroads. Social media was just starting out, DVD rentals were still huge, and audiences seemed to crave stories that packed a punch, emotionally. And this film, it definitely delivered that.
Oh, it did, for sure. And one thing that instantly grabs you is just the intensity of the storytelling. Gibson doesn't hold back in depicting Christ's suffering at all.
Mhm.
And the use of Aramaic dialogue, along with all those meticulous historical details, really amplifies the film's impact. What are your thoughts on the Aramaic? Did it truly enhance the film for you, or was it more of a stylistic choice?
Using Aramaic, that was a bold move. And I think it paid off. It added a layer of authenticity, like you're right there in that time period, experiencing everything alongside the characters.
You're right, it really transports you there. And that realism, as powerful as it is, it also contributed to the film's controversial reception. Some viewers were profoundly moved by its spiritual depth, while others, they found the graphic violence disturbing. And there were questions about the portrayal of certain religious groups. Some critics even accused Gibson of promoting anti-Semitic views. How do you view those criticisms? Were they justified, or were people missing the point?
The accusations of anti-Semitism are definitely complex. They require careful consideration. Some argue that the film's portrayal of Jewish authorities, well, it plays into harmful stereotypes and unfairly blames them for Christ's death. Others say Gibson was simply following the biblical account, and that any bias, well, it's in the eye of the beholder. It's a sensitive issue, no doubt. And it ignited a heated debate about the film's intentions, and its potential to reinforce negative perceptions.
It's definitely a conversation that needed to happen. And it's interesting how this film, regardless of any perceived biases, became a box office sensation. It ended up being one of the highest grossing R-rated movies ever, which is incredible for a film with such intense subject matter.
Yeah, the film's success is undeniable, but what's fascinating to me is how effectively faith-based communities rallied around it. This wasn't just a movie premiere, it was an event.
Mm.
Church groups, organized outings, word of mouth spread like wildfire, and the film really tapped into a deep well of religious sentiment. Do you remember the buzz around it back then?
Oh, I do. It was everywhere. And I think it really speaks to the power of community and shared belief when it comes to promoting a film like this. It's clear that The Passion of the Christ resonated with a very specific audience.
Mm.
And speaking of impact, this film's legacy goes way beyond its box office numbers. It really had a profound effect on religious filmmaking as a whole, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. The Passion of the Christ really opened the floodgates for other biblical epics to reach wider audiences. Films like Risen and Noah came after it, proving that there was a market for these kinds of stories and that they could be both commercially successful and critically acclaimed. It was a turning point.
Speaking of Risen, do you think it tried to follow the same intensely realistic style as Gibson's film, or was it going for something different?
Risen, while it dealt with a biblical story, it took a different route. It focused on what happened after the resurrection through the eyes of a Roman tribune. Kind of a more investigative, grounded perspective. It aimed for historical accuracy, but it didn't quite have the same intensity or graphic depiction as The Passion.
That's a good point. It seems like Risen was going for a more thought-provoking experience, exploring the mystery and intrigue surrounding the resurrection, while The Passion of the Christ was all about visceral impact and engaging your emotions. But both films, in their own way, show a renewed interest in bringing these biblical stories to life on the big screen.
Exactly, and the Passion of the Christ especially showed that audiences were eager for these narratives,
Hmm.
particularly when presented with a certain level of authenticity, that raw feeling.
And we can't forget Jim Caviezel's performance as Jesus. Emotionally shattering, deeply immersive, and it really showcased his dedication to the role. He even endured real lashes during the filming of the scourging scene.
Yeah, Caviezel's performance was captivating for sure. His willingness to endure physical hardship to embody the suffering of Christ, it speaks volumes about his commitment. Now, whether that level of realism was necessary, that's another discussion entirely. But it definitely added to the film's intensity and impact.
Right, it really gives you that feeling of witnessing something real and raw.
Mm.
And it's no surprise his performance continues to be praised for its emotional depth and authenticity.
Hmm.
Even though it's been years since it came out, the Passion of the Christ hasn't faded away. It's still brought up in conversations about faith in cinema. and that delicate balance between artistic expression and potentially provocative content. What do you think it is about this film that continues to spark debate and discussion, even after all this time?
I think it's that unflinching approach to depicting Christ's suffering, combined with the controversies surrounding its portrayal of certain characters and events. The Passion of the Christ doesn't shy away from the brutality of the crucifixion at all. And that raw, visceral style, it leaves a mark on you, you know? It forces you to confront those core tenets of the Christian faith and grapple with questions of faith, sacrifice, and redemption.
That makes sense. The film's intensity, along with its controversial elements, has made it a focal point for discussions about how faith is portrayed on screen, the boundaries of artistic license, and the responsibility filmmakers have when tackling sensitive historical and religious narratives.
Precisely. And the fact that there's still talk about a potential sequel focusing on the resurrection just proves its enduring relevance, doesn't it? The Passion of the Christ tapped into something deep, something profound. And its effects are still felt today, both in filmmaking and in broader cultural conversations about faith and spirituality.
Speaking of the sequel, do you think Gibson would approach it differently this time around, considering all the advancements in filmmaking technology and the evolving cultural landscape?
That's a great question. Would he keep that same level of intensity and realism? Would he address the criticisms and controversies surrounding the first film? It's fascinating to think how he might revisit this story and what new perspectives he might bring, especially given how much visual effects and storytelling techniques have advanced since the original film.
Those are all great questions, questions that I think both fans and critics are eager to have answered. It really speaks to the film's lasting impact, that even the possibility of a sequel can generate so much excitement and speculation.
Absolutely. And maybe that enduring legacy is the most intriguing thing about The Passion of the Christ. It's a film that continues to challenge and provoke us, reminding us of the power of storytelling and its ability to spark conversations that echo across generations.
We've covered a lot in this first part of our deep dive into The Passion of the Christ. We've explored its historical context, the controversies, its box office success, and its impact on both religious filmmaking and broader cultural conversations. What's coming up in part two?
In part two, we'll go deeper into the specific filmmaking techniques Gibson used to create such a powerful and visceral experience. We'll look at the cinematography, the use of light and shadow, the sound design, and those editing choices that gave the film its unique aesthetic and emotional impact. We'll also compare and contrast it with other films that deal with similar themes, analyzing how The Passion of the Christ stands out visually and in its storytelling approach.
Sounds fascinating. We'll be back soon for part two, so stay tuned.
Welcome back. All right, so let's turn our attention to the visual language of The Passion of the Christ. One thing that even got praise from big-time directors like James Cameron was the film's cinematography.
Cameron, wow, that's high praise, especially considering his own films are known for pushing visual boundaries. What do you think he saw in Gibson's work?
You know, Cameron, despite all the controversy surrounding the film, he saw the artistry. He acknowledged that masterful use of light and shadow to create drama and realism. Just think about that scene where Judas betrays Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. That interplay of darkness and the flickering torchlight, it builds this palpable tension. It's like a visual echo of the turmoil the characters are going through.
Yeah, I see what you mean. The film definitely embraces darkness, both literally and figuratively. And it's often contrasted with these moments of stark, almost ethereal light, particularly around Jesus. It's as if those moments of divine illumination are cutting through all the brutality and despair surrounding him.
Exactly. That contrast, it's intentional and it works. And it's not just the lighting, the composition of the shots is carefully done too. You see a lot of close-ups on Jesus's face, allowing us to see every drop of sweat, every bit of blood, every subtle emotion. It's incredibly intimate. It pulls you right into his suffering, almost to the point where it's unbearable at times.
It's definitely not a film you can just watch passively. Those close-ups force you to confront that raw pain head on. And then there are those wide shots, often showing these vast landscapes or the imposing architecture of Jerusalem. Those seem to have a different purpose, don't they?
For sure. Those wide shots create a sense of epic scope, reminding you of the bigger picture, the historical and spiritual context. It's a way to balance the intimacy of those close-ups with a broader perspective, highlighting both the personal and universal aspects of the story.
It's like you're experiencing the story on a personal level while also witnessing a grand historical drama.
Yeah.
And then there's the violence. We talked about the controversy surrounding it. But how do you think the cinematography contributes to its impact?
While the violence in The Passion is graphic, no doubt about it, and unflinching, but it's never gratuitous. Gibson uses the cinematography to make it feel real, agonizing. The camera doesn't shy away from the brutality of the scourging or the crucifixion. Those long takes, those close-ups, they make you confront the physical reality of Christ's suffering. You just can't look away.
It's almost like you're implicated in the violence, like you're forced to bear witness to it in all its horrifying detail. Do you think that was Gibson's intention, to make the audience feel complicit?
That's a really interesting question. I think Gibson wanted to portray Christ's suffering in the most realistic and impactful way possible. He wanted to strip away those romanticized versions we often see and present the crucifixion as the brutal, agonizing event that it was. Whether that makes the viewer feel complicit, that's open to interpretation.
It's definitely something that lingers in your mind long after the film ends. And speaking of things that linger, the sound design in The Passion is equally impactful, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. The sound design is masterfully done, creating atmosphere and evoking emotion. The use of silence is particularly effective. You have these moments of stark, deafening silence, punctuating the violence, amplifying its impact, leaving you with this unsettling feeling of emptiness.
Those moments of silence are almost as jarring as the sounds of the violence itself. It's like the silence allows the weight of what you've just seen to really sink in.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have the score, composed by John Debney. It's haunting, evocative, blending traditional orchestral elements with Middle Eastern influences. It creates this sonic landscape that feels ancient and timeless all at once.
The music definitely contributes to that epic, the almost mythic quality of the film. And it's not just the score, the sound effects are incredibly effective too. The sounds of those whips, the hammering of the nails, the gasps and cries of pain, it's also visceral and real.
Right. And there's the use of Aramaic again. We talked about how it added to the film's authenticity, but it has a sonic impact as well, doesn't it? The language has a unique rhythm and cadence that adds to that otherworldly atmosphere.
That's true. Even if you don't understand the words, the sound of the Aramaic just pulls you in, transporting you to a different time and place.
And let's not forget the editing. The editing in The Passion is masterful in how it builds tension and paces the story. The quick cuts during the violence create a sense of chaos, disorientation, reflecting the sheer brutality of what's happening.
And then you have those long, lingering shots that let the emotional weight of certain moments really sink in. It's a very deliberate approach to editing that enhances the overall impact.
Exactly. It's not just about cutting from one scene to the next. It's about using editing to shape the viewer's experience, guide their emotions.
So we've talked about the cinematography, the sound design, and the editing. All these elements come together to create a visual style that's both striking and unsettling, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. The visual style of The Passion of the Christ is a big part of its power and its controversy. It's a film that demands your attention, provokes strong emotions, and it stays with you long after it's over.
And it's a visual style that has clearly influenced other filmmakers who've tackled biblical stories since The Passion came out.
That's right. Films like Noah and Exodus, Gods and Kings have taken a similar approach. Epic in scale, visually ambitious, drawing inspiration from Gibson's work while also putting their own spin on things.
It's interesting how The Passion of the Christ has become a kind of benchmark for these biblical epics.
It's influenced how these stories are told visually, pushing the limits of what's possible when depicting these grand historical and spiritual events. It's a testament to the film's enduring legacy, that it continues to spark conversations and inspire new interpretations of these timeless narratives.
Welcome back to our deep dive into The Passion of the Christ. We've explored the film's historical context, its controversial aspects, its visual power, and even touched on its box office success. But as we wrap things up, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on its lasting impact. What kind of influence did this film have on other filmmakers and the trajectory of faith-based movies?
Well, there's no doubt The Passion of the Christ really served as a catalyst for a resurgence of these biblical epics. It showed that there was a huge audience out there, people who were hungry for these stories, especially when they were presented with a certain level of authenticity, a raw kind of feeling.
Yeah, it wasn't just a Sunday school film, right?
Yeah.
It took risks, pushed boundaries, wasn't afraid to confront that brutality at the core of the story.
Exactly. It really opened the door for other filmmakers to explore these themes, these narratives, with a boldness we hadn't really seen before.
So can we draw a direct line from The Passion of the Christ to other films that came after it?
Absolutely. Take Noah, for instance. Released in 2014, it's visually stunning, with a darker, more complex portrayal of Noah than we're used to seeing.
I remember the buzz around Noah when it came out. Some people were expecting a more traditional, family-friendly retelling, But Darren Aronofsky went in a much bolder direction, exploring themes of environmentalism, free will, even the nature of good and evil.
Right, and that willingness to tackle those complex themes and present a flawed human Noah that can definitely be seen as a direct influence of the Passion of the Christ. It showed that these biblical stories could be used to explore really profound philosophical and moral questions.
And it wasn't just Noah either. Ridley Scott's Exodus, Gods and Kings, released the same year,
Yeah.
also took a more gritty, realistic approach to depicting that story.
Exodus is another great example of a film that benefited from the Passion's trailblazing. It had that epic scale, the visual grandeur, but it also dug into the political and personal conflicts, offering a more nuanced look at Moses and Ramses.
It seems like The Passion of the Christ gave filmmakers this permission to move beyond those safe, sanitized versions of biblical stories and really embrace that complexity, the ambiguity that's inherent in these narratives.
Yeah, and it's interesting to note the different perspectives within the genre, too. Some films went down that road of intensity and realism, while others took a more introspective approach.
Oh, can you give an example of that?
Sure, Risen, which we talked about earlier, is a great example. It explores faith from a more investigative, philosophical angle, less about the physical suffering of Christ and more about the impact of the resurrection on those who witnessed it.
That's a good point. It's like the genre itself expanded to include these different ways of telling stories, different ways of engaging with those questions of faith. And the Passion of the Christ played a big part in that.
Oh, absolutely. It challenged those conventions, pushed the boundaries, inspired a whole new generation of filmmakers to come at these stories with fresh eyes, with bold visions.
So beyond its impact on filmmaking, what about its broader cultural significance? The Passion was a global phenomenon. It sparked conversations about faith, art, representation. Why do you think it resonated so deeply with audiences all over the world?
I think it really tapped into something fundamental about the human experience. It's a story about sacrifice, redemption, that age-old struggle between good and evil. Those are themes that go beyond any culture or religion. They speak to our deepest hopes and fears, I think.
It's also a story about faith, and I think regardless of your own personal beliefs, the film's portrayal of that unwavering faith, even in the face of unimaginable suffering, it really had an impact on people.
And it's interesting to see how its legacy continues to unfold. We're still talking about it. And those talks about a potential sequel focusing on the resurrection just add to its relevance today.
It's like the Passion of the Christ opened this door that can't be closed. It reignited our fascination with these biblical stories and sparked these conversations that are still going on in our modern world.
And maybe that's the most profound legacy of all. It reminded us of the power of storytelling, its ability to take us across time and cultures, and its capacity to spark those meaningful conversations that challenge us, inspire us.
Well said. And to our listener, we hope this deep dive has given you some new insights into this complex and enduring film. What are your thoughts on The Passion of the Christ? How has it impacted you? We encourage you to keep the conversation going, explore the themes and questions that this film raises. Thanks for joining us.